The fire had burned low by the time Orin asked the question his mother had dreaded for 7 years. He was sitting cross-legged on the stone floor of their mountain shelter, 7 years old and already built like something ancient. Broad through the shoulders, his jaw set with a stubbornness that had nothing to do with her. His twin Soren sat beside him on the worn wooden bench, quieter, watchful, his dark eyes carrying a weight that no child should have learned so young. Outside, the Veyrath mountains were howling. Wind scraped the pine trees raw. Snow pressed hard against the shutters, and the single oil lamp between them threw their shadows long and restless across the stone walls. Leora was stirring the pot. She didn't stop stirring. Mama. Orin's voice had that edge to it, the one that meant he wasn't going to let it go tonight. Who is our father? She had rehearsed her answers 100 times. He is gone. He is someone I once knew. He is a man who made a choice, and the choice was not us. None of those words came out. What came out was silence. The particular kind of silence that fills a room when a woman is holding something enormous behind her ribs and smiling anyway. She turned to face them. Both boys were watching her. Soren's expression was careful, measured. The way he always absorbed pain quietly before deciding what to do with it. Orin's jaw was tighter. He already suspected she was protecting him from something true. You look like him, she thought, both of you. Every single morning I see him in your faces, and I am glad and I am broken. And I do not know which one wins on any given day. He was a powerful man, she said finally. Her voice was steady. She had learned to make her voice steady. And he made choices I couldn't forgive. Did he know about us? Soren asked. A log collapsed in the hearth. Sparks scattered. No, she said. That was the truth. The only version of the truth she could live with. Because the alternative, that he had known and still let them vanish into the cold, was something she had decided long ago would destroy her if she held it too closely. What she did not tell them was this, that 700 miles south, inside the ancient stronghold of Valdrek, the Alpha King of all the mountain territories had not slept a full night in 7 years, that he had sent his best trackers across 6 territories, that he had stood in an empty corridor 3 years ago, holding a small piece of green ribbon, the same ribbon she used to braid her hair, found near a borderland crossing, and had not spoken for 2 days. That the man her sons asked about in firelight, in a mountain shelter where the wind never stopped, was looking for them, had always been looking, and was getting closer. Chapter 1. The mornings came hard in the Veyrath foothills, not gradually the way dawn moves in softer places, creeping in slow and gold across still water. Here, morning arrived like a blade. Cold air through the gaps in the shutters, frost on the inner windowsill. The sound of wind pulling at the pine canopy above the shelter, restless and old, as though the mountain itself was deciding whether to tolerate another day of human presence on its slopes. Leora was always awake before the light. She had learned in the first winter that survival in this place was a matter of margins. Too slow to gather firewood and the cold won. Too careless with the herb stores and the trading season collapsed. Too trusting of a stranger's face, and everything unraveled. She had made every one of those mistakes in the beginning, alone and pregnant, and moving through a landscape that had no interest in her survival. She had made them once each. She did not make them again. Now she moved through the morning routine with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped grieving the life she'd had before. She stoked the fire. She checked the drying racks, bundles of mountain sage, fever root, pale winterbloom, running her fingers along each one with the practiced attention of a woman who knew the difference between ready and almost ready, and understood that almost never counted when you needed coin. She portioned the morning meal in 2 bowls, slightly larger than her own, and set them near the warmth. Then she stood in the doorway for a moment, just breathing. The foothills stretched out below in layers of grey and deep green, the pine forest dense and close, The nearest settlement a half-hour's walk through terrain. She could navigate blind by now. Smoke from a few chimneys. A dog barking somewhere below. The ordinary sounds of people surviving in a hard place. This is enough, she told herself. The way she told herself every morning. A deliberate act, not a feeling. You told yourself something enough times, and eventually it held. Orin hit the doorframe on his way out. Not accidentally. He hit it because he was moving too fast, as he always moved, and because 7 years old and already built like a small battering ram, he had not yet learned that the world did not simply move out of his way. He made a sound of irritation, shook it off, and kept moving. Out into the cold morning without his outer layer, heading directly for the woodpile. "Cloak," Leora said. "I'm not cold. You will be in 3 minutes." A pause. Then Orin turned back, grabbed the cloak from the hook beside the door, threw it over his shoulders without breaking stride, and resumed his path to the woodpile, with the energy of someone who had already decided that today was going to require more space than yesterday. Soren appeared behind him, fully dressed, moving with the unhurried calm that had been his nature since he was old enough to have one. He paused beside Leora in the doorway, watching his brother haul wood with unnecessary aggression. "He had the dream again," Soren said quietly. Leora didn't ask which dream. There was only one, the one Orin refused to describe in detail, but that left him restless and too warm and prone to picking fights with immovable objects. She nodded once and filed it away. By mid-morning they were in the tree line, moving along the ridge path toward the lower meadow, where the winter bloom grew thickest at this time of year. Leora walked ahead. The boys moved behind her, and she listened, always listening, to the rhythm of their footsteps, the variations in their breathing, the small sounds that told her where their attention was. "Step softer," she said without turning. "You're broadcasting." "There's no one out here," Orin said. "You don't know that. That's the point." She heard him adjust, grudgingly, but he adjusted. This was the part she could not explain to him yet, in a way that wouldn't require explanations she wasn't ready to give. She couldn't tell him that soft footsteps weren't just forest discipline, that moving quietly through a world that might be watching you was a skill she had developed out of necessity, not preference, that there were specific kinds of danger she was still, after 7 years, half convinced might find them. Instead, she taught him the principles and let the reasons come later. Pick your footing before you commit. Read the wind direction before you speak. If a stranger's eyes linger on you too long, walk away calmly and do not look back. Soren had absorbed all of it without question, cataloguing each lesson the way he catalogued everything. Silently, thoroughly, accessible when needed. Orin absorbed it too, but fought it first, which was its own kind of thorough. The merchant arrived at the settlement just before dusk. He came through on a trade route that touched their foothills maybe twice a season. A weathered man with a cart of dry goods and bolts of cheaper wool, making the rounds of the border settlements before the deep winter closed the upper passes. Leora was at the trading post, exchanging 3 weeks of carefully dried herbs when he came in, stamping snow from his boots, and scanning the room with the automatic habit of a man who assessed every space for opportunity. The boys were near the door. Orin was attempting to balance on the edge of a crate. Soren was watching him with the quiet attention of someone calculating the exact moment the attempt would fail. The merchant's gaze passed over them, moved on, and then came back. He stilled. It was a small thing, a half-second. The kind of pause a person makes when something registers without them meaning it to. His eyes moved between Orin and Soren. Their height, the set of their shoulders, the particular architecture of their faces. And something flickered in his expression that Leora could not entirely read. He said it almost to himself. Low offhand, not even directed at anyone. "They've got the Valdrek, look about them." The room continued around her. Someone laughed across the space. A child knocked something over. The fire crackled indifferently. Leora set her coin down on the counter with a steady hand, gathered her goods, and said nothing. She smiled at the settlement elder on her way out. She walked the twins home at a normal pace. She made supper. She waited until both boys were asleep. Then she sat beside the banked fire in the dark and did not sleep at all. Chapter 2. Commander Aldrich had served 3 Alpha Kings in his lifetime. He had watched the first grow old and bitter, eaten by the smallness of old victories. He had watched the second burn bright and die young, the way reckless men often did. He had served Darius for 11 years now, and what he had watched, particularly in the last 7, was something quieter and more difficult than either of those. He had watched a powerful man learn to carry a weight he refused to put down. He noticed it in the mornings most. The tracker reports came in with the first courier, before the administrative documents, before the territorial briefs, before anything requiring the king's seal. That was not standard protocol. That was a standing order Darius had issued in the 2nd month after the exile and never rescinded. Every morning, without ceremony, the latest reports from the search network landed on the desk first. Aldrich had arranged it himself, initially assuming it was a temporary grief, a man in the acute phase of a mistake, doing what men did, searching obsessively until reality imposed itself. 7 years later, the order still stood. Aldrich carried the morning stack up the stone corridor himself today. He often did when he wanted an honest look at the king without the performance of court around them. The stronghold was quiet at this hour, the kind of heavy institutional quiet that belonged to old stone and cold air, to a building that had absorbed centuries of power and learned to keep its own counsel. Torches burned low in the iron brackets along the walls. The floors were bare and dark, worn smooth by boots and time. He knocked once and entered. Darius was already at the desk. He had, as far as Aldrich could determine, been there for some time. A half-eaten meal sat pushed to one corner, the candle beside it burned to 1/3 of its original height. The king was reading. Not a tracker reports. Not yet. But a territorial survey from the southern passes, his expression carrying the flat concentration of a man processing information on one level while thinking about something else entirely on another. He was 41 years old. He looked it in the way that battle-worn men look their age, not with softness, but with accumulation. The years had added weight to his jaw, lines at the corners of his eyes, a particular economy of movement that came from a man who had stopped wasting energy on performance. He was still formidable, perhaps more so, but there was something in him that hadn't been there before. A permanent settlement of some heavier thing, as though grief had moved in and rearranged the furniture, and was simply part of the architecture now. Aldrich set the stack on the corner of the desk without comment. Darius moved the territorial survey aside and picked up the tracker reports first. As he always did, the document he kept in the lower left drawer was not a secret, exactly. His inner circle knew it existed. No one discussed it. It was the original exile order, 1 page, formal language, the kind of bureaucratic coldness that institutions develop for their most human decisions. At the bottom, his seal pressed into dark wax, his signature beside it. He had signed it at the height of the political crisis, when the council was unified against Leora, and the accusation had the weight of 3 noble families behind it, and he had believed, had told himself he believed, that he needed more time, that he would find the evidence to clear her. That exile was temporary, reversible, a political maneuver he could undo once the pressure cleared. He had been wrong about how fast things could become permanent. Lady Vessa's exposure had come 18 months later, not through anything Darius had built or uncovered, a fact he carried with a specific, grinding shame. She had overreached. Emboldened by her success with Leora, she had moved against another woman in the council's orbit, and this time she had been careless. A letter. A witnessed conversation. A pattern that unraveled quickly once someone began pulling the thread. Darius had sat in the council chamber when the evidence was presented. He had listened to every word with the controlled stillness he had developed, for moments that required him not to show what was happening inside his chest. When it was done, when the vote was unanimous, when Vessa's family seat was stripped, and her exile to the eastern borderlands confirmed, he had said nothing. He had watched her walk out of the hall. She had looked at him once, at the door. He had looked back. That was all. He had returned to his quarters afterward and stood at the window for a long time, looking north toward the mountains, understanding, with full clarity, for the first time, that clearing Leora's name changed nothing about where she was, or whether she was alive, or what the 17 months since her exile had cost her. Justice for Vessa was not the same as justice for Leora. He had confused the two, briefly, and the confusion had made him feel worse than the grief. The search had intensified after that. It had never fully stopped. Aldrich was still in the room when the tracker arrived. Wren was the best in the network. Lean, quiet, precise, with language in the way that men were precise when they had learned that imprecision in this particular role had consequences. He entered without being summoned, which meant the information warranted interruption. Darius set down the report he was holding. Wren spoke carefully. 2 boys, Omega-born by their scent signatures, spotted near a small border settlement in the Veyrath foothills. Mountain raised. You could tell by the way they moved, the terrain ease, the unself-consciousness of children who had grown up in hard country. Their ages, based on height and build, estimated at 6 or 7 years. Unusual size for that age, unusual bearing. Wren paused there, in the way a man paused when he had one more thing to say, and was selecting his words with care. One of them, he said, not quite meeting the king's eyes. The one the settlement folk called the loud one. Another pause. He has your jaw, my lord. The room was very quiet. Darius did not move for a long moment. Then he set down the papers in his hand, slowly and precisely, the way a man moved when he was concentrating very hard on the surface level of things to avoid the depth below it. When do we ride? Aldrich asked quietly. Tomorrow, Darius said, before first light. Chapter 3, Darius rode north the way he did everything now, without announcement. No banners, no ceremonial guard. 6 men, chosen for their discretion and their ability to move quietly through mountain terrain, and Aldrich riding half a length behind him, the way he always did. Close enough to intervene, far enough to give the king the illusion of solitude. The company left Valdrek before the settlement fires were lit, in that particular darkness that existed between the last of night and the reluctant arrival of morning. He had made himself a rule over 7 years of leads that dissolved into nothing. He did not let himself believe until he was standing in front of the evidence. He had learned this the hard way, the particular cruelty of hope that built itself on incomplete information and then collapsed. He had felt that collapse 4 times. 4 leads that seemed certain, that had the weight of probability behind them, that turned out to be wrong in ways both small and devastating. After the 4th, he had restructured how he allowed himself to think about the search, not as a man looking for someone he loved, as a man following information, 1 step at a time, no further than the evidence warranted. This was a lead, nothing more. He told himself this steadily, as the pine forests closed around the road and the mountain air replaced the stronghold's cold stone smell with something older and wilder. He told himself this, and kept his eyes on the path ahead, and did not think about a 7-year-old boy with his jaw. 3 days' ride north, in the Veyrath foothills, the trouble started, as it usually did, with Orin deciding something was wrong and acting on it before the decision had fully completed. He had heard about it 2 days earlier. Older boys from the Creswick settlement, 10 and 11 years old, thick with the confidence of size, had been working a quiet pressure on the smaller border communities during trade exchanges. Nothing dramatic, a thumb on the scale, a bundle of goods short-counted, the kind of slow drain that communities absorbed because confronting it directly cost more than the loss. Leora's settlement had been absorbing it for 3 months. Orin had absorbed it for approximately as long as it took him to understand what was happening, which was one conversation with the settlement elder's wife. He went to the Creswick trade point alone, on a morning when Leora was on the far side of the ridge, checking the upper herb lines. He walked in without a plan beyond the general principle that someone needed to say something, and that he was available to be that person. He started talking. He was polite initially, specific. He laid out the discrepancy in the last 3 exchanges with the calm directness of a child who had grown up watching his mother negotiate with people who underestimated her, and had absorbed the style without the patience. The older boys found this amusing. Then they found it irritating. Then the largest one shoved him, apparently expecting that to conclude the matter. It did not conclude the matter. Leora found him 40 minutes later at the edge of the tree line, sitting on a flat rock with his hand wrapped in his own sleeve, a split across the second knuckle that was still seeping. His lower lip was swollen on one side. His expression was the particular combination of satisfied and defensive that she had come to recognize as I won. But I know what you're going to say. She sat beside him without a word. She unwrapped his hand, examined it, and retrieved the small medicine kit she had carried in her coat pocket every day for 6 years. She cleaned the knuckle with practiced efficiency, while Orin stared at the middle distance and said nothing. Soren materialized from the trees behind them, settled onto a nearby rock, and opened the book balanced across his knees. A battered collection of territorial histories they had traded 3 months of remedies to acquire, with the air of someone who had been present for the whole thing and considered his role to be observational. There were 3 of them, Orin offered. Older, No, Leora said. We were right about the short counting. I know that too. She wrapped his knuckle with a strip of linen, her movements efficient and without anger, which Orin understood from experience to be more serious than anger. She tied it off and held his hand for a moment before releasing it. Strength without judgment, she said, is just damage that hasn't landed yet. Orin looked at her. She looked back, calm and direct. The problem wasn't that you went, she said. The problem was that you went alone, without telling anyone, without a plan, past the first sentence. You got lucky today. 3 older boys and you got lucky. One of those variables changes, and we're having a different conversation. He absorbed this the way he absorbed her harder lessons, not easily, but genuinely. She watched him turn it over, file it somewhere. All right, he said. That was all. With Orin, that was enough. Soren turned a page. He had not looked up through any of it. His expression was the settled, interior kind he wore when he was processing something at a separate level from his immediate surroundings. When he spoke, it was to the book. He sounds like the man in the stories. The wind moved through the pines. Leora went very still. What stories, she said. Her voice came out even. She was proud of that. Soren looked up then. His dark eyes found hers with the directness he always had. The kind that made her feel, occasionally, that she was speaking with someone considerably older than 7. The ones we've put together, he said simply. She looked between them. Orin was watching her now too, the defensive satisfaction gone from his expression, replaced with something more careful. They told her, between them, in the methodical way of children who had been quietly building something for a long time, small things. A word she had used once, stronghold in a context she hadn't meant to, the way her hands stilled when a trader's conversation drifted toward Valdrek. A night 2 years ago, when she had thought they were asleep and had stood at the window for a long time, saying nothing, facing south. He's from Valdrek, Soren said. Not a question. The pines moved. The mountain held its cold silence. Leora looked at her sons, their steady eyes, the patience they had learned from her, the quiet determination she had not meant to teach them, but had anyway, and understood that the careful walls she'd built around the past were thinner than she had believed. She said nothing, which they both understood was its own kind of answer. Chapter 4. Aldrich hated it every time. The king would rise before the camp, before the sentinels had rotated, before the fire had been rebuilt from its overnight coals, and he would simply be gone. No word, no direction. Just the empty bedroll and the cold that had settled into the space where a man had been sleeping, and the particular silence that meant Darius had decided, again, that there were things he needed to do without company. Aldrich had learned, across years of service, that there was no preventing it. He could post men closer. He could arrange the camp to make quiet departure more difficult. Darius would find another way out, and they would have the same conversation afterward, patient on Darius's side, controlled on Aldrich's. That resolved nothing, so he let it happen, as he always did, and simply ensured the men were ready to move fast if they needed to. The second morning in the Veyrath foothills was the clearest they'd had. The cloud cover that had pressed down on the mountains for 3 days had lifted sometime before dawn, and what replaced it was the particular sharp beauty of high country in late season. A sky so blue it seemed almost aggressive, the snow on the upper ridges catching early light and throwing it back in hard, clean angles. The forest floor was frozen, solid underfoot. Every step cracked. Every breath came out white. Darius moved through the tree line alone, following no particular path, which was the point. He was not tracking. He was not executing a search pattern. He was doing the thing he had learned to do when the weight of what he was carrying became too concentrated. Moving through open terrain, cold air, physical ground, until the weight redistributed itself enough to be functional again. He heard the creak before he saw it. Frozen at the edges, still running dark through the center, cutting a line through a small clearing where several large pines had come down in what looked like a winter storm from the previous year. Their roots had pulled massive plates of earth up with them when they fell, leaving shallow craters now filled with snow and ice, and their trunks lay across the clearing in overlapping angles. One of those trunks had, apparently, offended someone deeply. The boy was 7 years old and attempting to move a fallen pine with his bare hands. Not the whole tree. He had identified a section, perhaps twice his own length, and had decided, through some internal reasoning that Darius could not entirely follow, that it needed to be elsewhere. He had found leverage points. He had tried 3 different approaches, each one visible in the disturbed snow around the log. All 3 had failed. He was currently on the 4th. Shoulder pressed against the bark. His boots finding purchase in the frozen earth, applying force with the absolute commitment of someone who had not yet accepted that the tree was not going to move. Darius stopped at the tree line. He did not step into the clearing, he simply watched. The boy's jaw was set. His breathing was controlled, deliberate, not panicked. When the log refused to shift again, he stepped back, looked at it with narrowed eyes, and began assessing for a 5th approach. Not frustrated, recalibrating. Something in Darius's chest moved in a way he didn't have words for. Then the boy looked up and saw him. What happened in the next 2 seconds told Darius more than a tracker report could have. The boy went still. One beat, purely instinctive, the automatic pause of a child raised in cautious country. Then his shoulders came back, his chin leveled. He turned to face Darius fully, feet planted at shoulder width, eyes direct and measuring. No fear, not a trace of it. Wariness, yes. The intelligent wariness of a child who had been taught that strangers required evaluation. But fear was entirely absent, and in its place was something that Darius recognized the way you recognized a language you had grown up speaking. The seizing sensation in his chest sharpened into something almost painful. You're on the wrong side of the creek for the border settlements. The boy's voice was steady, accusatory without apology. Darius didn't respond immediately. He was still processing, the set of the jaw, the stance, the refusal to give ground. Then movement at his peripheral, slow, deliberate, unhurried. A second boy stepped out from behind a pine tree to Darius's left. He had been there the entire time. How long, Darius couldn't determine. Standing with his back against the bark in perfect stillness, watching. He was the same age as the first, clearly the same blood. But where the first was a struck match, this one was deep water. His eyes moved over Darius with a calm, thorough attention that felt less like a child looking at a stranger, and more like someone taking a careful inventory before making a considered decision. He said, "You're not from a border settlement." Not a question. A conclusion already reached, simply being stated aloud. Darius made a decision. He stepped into the clearing slowly, movements deliberate, non-threatening. The way you moved around something you did not want to startle, and crouched down, bringing himself level with them. The cold from the frozen ground came up through his boots immediately. "No," he said. "I'm not." He looked at the first boy. "What's your name?" A beat. The boy weighed the question, weighed him, and then apparently decided that the answer cost nothing. Orin. The word hit Darius somewhere below the sternum. He went very still. He did not look away from them. He let himself look. Really look. In the way he had not allowed himself to do from the tree line. Because from the tree line he had still been maintaining the rule. Still telling himself this was a lead. Just a lead. Nothing more until the evidence was undeniable. The evidence was undeniable. It wasn't one thing. It was everything. Accumulated in a single sustained moment. The jaw. The stunts. The eyes that were shaped like his, but carried something entirely their own, the quality of their stillness and their courage, the bone-deep recognition that moved through him like something tectonic. He didn't speak. There were no words constructed for this moment. And he understood, with sudden clarity, that anything he said right now would be inadequate in a way that would matter later. The quieter boy had been watching him throughout. He watched the stillness come over Darius's face. He watched whatever moved behind the king's eyes. He processed all of it with that unnerving calm, and then he spoke. "You know our mother, don't you?" The frozen creek ran on beneath its ice. The pines held their cold silence. Also not a question. Chapter 5, it was Marit who said it. The elder's wife, broad-shouldered and plain-spoken, the kind of woman who delivered information the way she delivered everything. Without ceremony between other tasks, as though the weight of a thing was not her responsibility to manage. She mentioned it while she and Leora were sorting the communal grain store, fingers working through the dry stock for signs of damp or rot. The conversation moving through the ordinary topics of a border settlement in late season. "Company camped in the lower pine corridor last night," Marit said. 6 men, well armed, not borderland armed, properly armed. Good horses. She turned a handful of grain, discarded a clump. One of them with a bearing I can't describe, except to say, "He looks like someone who's used to being obeyed." She said it casually, the way you mentioned weather. Leora's hands kept moving through the grain. Her face did not change. "How close?" she asked. "Half a league south, maybe less." Leora nodded once. The way she nodded at information she was filing rather than responding to. And finished the row she was working through, and made her excuses, and walked back to the shelter at a pace that was not quite running and was not quite calm. She had done this twice before. The first time had been 14 months after she arrived in the foothills. A Valdrek patrol moving through the borderlands on what turned out to be a routine territorial survey, nothing to do with her at all. She hadn't known that. She had packed in under an hour and moved the boys 12 miles north through freezing rain, arriving at a secondary shelter she'd prepared for exactly this eventuality, and spent 4 days there before confirming the patrol had moved on. The boys had been infants. They had not understood what was happening. The second time, Orin had been 3, and Soren had been 3, and she had moved them again for nothing, again into cold and disruption, and the grinding exhaustion of survival recalibrated from scratch. Both times she had told herself, "This is what it costs. This is what you pay for safety." She accepted the cost each time. She accepted it now, moving through the shelter with the practiced efficiency of someone who had thought through this exact sequence on 100 ordinary evenings. The way you thought through fire escapes and bad weather, not with fear, but with the grim pragmatism of a woman who had learned what happened when you weren't prepared. The medicine kit, the coin reserve from beneath the floorboard, the dried stores that would travel, the boys' warmer layers, the documents, ownership records for the herb trade, the papers that established her identity in the border settlements under the quiet, unremarkable name she had taken when she arrived. She moved through each item with steady hands and a mind that had narrowed itself to the clean simplicity of a list. She was halfway through packing when the door opened. Orin came in first. His expression was not the expression of a child returning from an ordinary morning in the woods. It was something she had never seen on him before. A careful, subdued quality like energy that had been deliberately turned down. He looked at her, at the open pack on the table at her face. He didn't speak. Soren came in behind him. He also looked at the pack. Then he looked at her, and in his eyes was the particular thing she had come to dread most in her quieter son. Not the absence of emotion, but the absolute presence of understanding. He knew exactly what she was doing. He had known, probably, before he walked through the door. Neither of them moved from the entrance. Because there was someone else behind them. He filled the doorframe the way large men did. Not dramatically, not with performance, simply by being the size he was and being present. He had to angle slightly to clear the frame. He stopped in the threshold, one hand resting on the wood, and he looked at her. Leora had imagined this moment. In the first years especially, she had imagined it with the obsessive, exhausting frequency of someone who could not stop rehearsing a scene they desperately needed to be prepared for. She had imagined his authority, his excuses, the political language of a king who had learned to make failure sound like circumstance. She had imagined the guilt she would see on his face, and she had decided, long ago, exactly how she would meet it. She had not imagined this. He was older. The years had done the honest work that years did on a man who carried something heavy, lines at the corners of his eyes, deeper channels along his jaw, a thinness through the face that hadn't been there before. He was broader through the shoulders than she remembered, and more worn. And he was looking at her with an expression that dismantled every rehearsed response she had prepared. Not authority, not the managed guilt of a man performing accountability, just grief, plain and unguarded, the way grief was when a person had stopped, trying to make it look like something more manageable. It sat on his face without apology, without architecture, without the careful framing of a king who understood how he was being perceived. He was simply looking at her, the way a man looked at something he had lost and had not stopped looking for. 7 years of it sitting in his expression like sediment. He said her name, not a title, not the formal designation the kingdom had assigned her, or the words the exile order had used, or any of the language that had accumulated around her identity in that last terrible season in Valdrek. Just her name, the way it had sounded when it was only hers, before everything else was attached to it. Leora. Like it was the word he had been holding in reserve. Like it was the only one that had remained fully intact. She felt it move through her the way she had been afraid it would. Beneath the surface, where her decisions lived, where the careful walls she had built were load-bearing. She felt it, and she recognized it, and she did what she had spent 7 years learning to do. She straightened, both hands flat on the table, chin level, eyes direct. "You need to leave," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was, in this moment, enormously grateful for everything hard thing that had ever taught her to make her voice steady. Chapter 6. She gave the boys instructions the way she gave all her important instructions. Quietly, directly, without room for negotiation, disguised as discussion, and received them with a nod. Orin opened his mouth, looked at her face, and closed it again. They took their outer layers from the hooks by the door and left for the settlement elder's home without protest, which told her everything about what they had understood from the last 10 minutes. Her sons were perceptive, in the way that children raised in careful circumstances became perceptive. Not precociously, but practically. They had learned to read the temperature of a room, because the temperature of a room had mattered in their lives in real ways. She watched them go from the doorway. Then she turned to Darius and said, "1 hour," and walked past him into the cold. There was a place at the eastern edge of the settlement, where the tree line pulled back from a flat shelf of rock overlooking the lower valley. Leora had come here, over the years, when she needed to think without walls around her. The drop was not severe, perhaps 30 feet to the slope below, but the elevation gave a clean view of the foothills stretching south, the pine forest unbroken for miles, the pale winter sky pressing down on all of it with the indifferent weight of altitude. She stood at the edge of the rock. Darius stood several feet behind her. She had chosen this position deliberately. She needed to be the one deciding where to look. She started talking. She did not shout. She had known, walking here, that she wasn't going to shout. Shouting was for people who still needed the other persons to feel the size of what they'd done. Leora no longer needed Darius to feel anything in particular. What she needed, what she had perhaps needed for 7 years without a container for it, was to say the true thing out loud, in plain language, to the person it was about. So she was precise. She told him about the first winter, the borderland settlements as that had taken her in not out of kindness, but out of the pragmatic hospitality of hard country. You sheltered the stranger because the mountains were indifferent, and someday you might be the stranger. She told him about learning at 4 months pregnant and exhausted in ways she hadn't known exhaustion could reach, which plants in unfamiliar terrain were safe and which ones weren't. She had made one mistake. She told him about that too, the 3 days of illness that followed, alone in a borrowed shelter, when she had understood with complete clarity that if she died here, no one who knew her name would come. She told him about the birth. Her voice remained even throughout this part, which cost her more than anything else. She told him about the midwife, an older woman from a settlement 2 days' walk away, recommended by someone who owed Leora a favor, and how the woman had been competent and not unkind and had left the morning after because she had her own family and her own winter to manage. She told him about the hours after that, alone with 2 newborn boys who needed things from her that she was not certain she had the physical resources left to give. I looked at their faces, she said, and they looked like you, both of them, immediately. There was no version of looking at them where I didn't see you. She paused. The wind moved through the pines below. I loved them, she said, completely, and from the first moment without condition. That part was simple. Another pause. The rest of it wasn't simple. Loving them and loving you were so tangled together for those first months that I couldn't locate the edges. I didn't know where the grief ended and the love started. I was furious with you every time I fed them. I was grateful for you every time they slept. I couldn't separate any of it. She turned then. She looked at him directly, the way she had decided she was going to, without softening it, without managing his response. I'm not telling you this so you can apologize, she said. I'm telling you because you should know the full weight of what one hesitation costs. What it actually costs. Not in principle, in specifics. Darius had not moved. He had stood through all of it with a stillness that was not the stillness of someone shutting down, but of someone forcing themselves to remain fully open to each word as it arrived, without the protective instinct to contextualize or defend. His jaw was set. There was something in his expression that was beyond guilt. Guilt was a feeling a person could manage, could process into something more bearable. What was on his face was the particular anguish of complete understanding, which was worse. He did not reach for her. He did not offer the words she might once have wanted from him. The explanations, the political context, the sequence of events as they had looked from his position. She had not asked for any of that, and he understood, with a clarity that had apparently cost him 7 years to develop, that offering it now would be a way of centering himself in a story that belonged to her. When she finished, the silence held for a long moment. Then he spoke, low and without performance. I know I can't give those 7 years back. He let that sit. I am not here to ask you to pretend I can. The wind came through again. Below them a bird crossed the pale strip of sky between 2 ridges and disappeared. I am here because they deserve to know who they are, he said, and because I never stopped looking for you. She held his gaze for a moment, measuring, as she always measured now, the distance between what a man said and what a man was. Then she turned back toward the settlement. She said nothing, because there were things she was not yet ready to say, and she had learned across 7 hard years that silence was not the same as surrender. Sometimes it was the most honest response available. She walked back along the rock shelf toward the tree line. Behind her, Darius did not follow. He stood where she had left him, looking out at the foothills stretching south. Not defeated, she would have recognized defeated, but settled. Patient in the way of a man who had finally located the thing he'd been searching for and understood, with full sobriety, that finding it was only the beginning of the work. Chapter 7, Leora had not told them what to do with him. This was, Orin decided, as close to permission as he was likely to get. He found Darius the next morning at the edge of the camp, where the pine trees thinned toward a flat stretch of ground that the frost had made hard and grey and even. Darius was alone. His men were elsewhere, doing the quiet work of men who had learned to occupy themselves without direction, and he was moving through what appeared to be a slow, deliberate warm-up sequence, not performance, maintenance, the kind of movement that belonged to someone who kept a body functional the way you kept a blade functional. Regularly. Without drama, because the alternative was a body that failed you when it mattered. Orin watched from the tree line for approximately 30 seconds. Then he walked out and said, I want to see if you can fight. Darius stopped moving. He looked at the boy for a moment. Really looked. The way Orin had already noticed he looked at things, with a completeness that didn't feel like assessment so much as genuine attention. Then he said, all right, and turned to face him fully. No hesitation, no crouching down to manage the request into something more appropriate. No smile that would have made the whole thing condescending. Just, all right, like it was a reasonable thing to be asked, and he intended to take it seriously. Orin approved of this, though he didn't say so. What followed was not what he had expected, which was part of the point. He had expected either performance, a grown man going through motions to impress a child, or dismissal dressed up as instruction. What he got was neither. Darius engaged with him at the level Orin actually occupied, which meant he matched the energy without managing it, offered resistance that was calibrated to be real without being overwhelming, and when Orin made a mistake, dropping his left side on an approach, something his mother had corrected him on twice. Darius stopped and named it plainly. Your left drops when you commit. Someone patient will wait for that. I know, Orin said. Then stop doing it. They went again. Orin focused on the left side. It was harder than it should have been. The habit was deep, but he held it for longer than before, and Darius noticed and said nothing about it, which Orin appreciated more than praise would have been. Then came the third round. Orin felt it immediately. The slight softening of resistance, the almost imperceptible shift in Darius's weight that opened a line it shouldn't have. He took the opening on instinct, landed the touch, and felt the wrongness of it arrive at the same moment as the result. He stepped back. You let me win that, he said. Darius was quiet for a beat. I did, he said. Why? Another beat. Shorter. I wanted to see how you'd respond to winning. It was the wrong thing to do. Orin looked at him steadily. You were testing me? Yes. By cheating, yes. No deflection in it. No softening. That was a poor decision. We'll do it again properly. They did it again properly. This time, the line didn't open and Orin didn't find a way through it. And he walked away from the attempt with a clear and unglamorous understanding of exactly where the gap between his current ability and Darius's existed. It was a large gap. He filed this information away without resentment. He also filed away the response about the cheating, turned it over. A man who admitted plainly and without qualification that he had done the wrong thing and then corrected it. That was a specific kind of man. Orin had not decided yet what to do with that information, but he kept it. Soren came in the afternoon. He arrived at the camp with the unhurried purposefulness that characterized everything he did, found Darius sitting against a pine with a territorial document across his knee, and said, I'd like to speak with you. Darius set the document aside. Soren sat across from him on a flat stone, settled his hands in his lap and began. The first question was, why did you wait? Not what happened or can you explain? The softer framings that invited narrative and context. Just the stripped, essential question that went directly to the center of the thing. Darius answered it honestly, because he had believed he could manage the political situation without acting immediately, and because that belief had been wrong, and because the cost of that wrongness had been paid entirely by someone other than himself. Soren listened, moved to the next question. When you found out the accusation was false, what did you do? This one was harder to answer honestly. Darius answered it anyway. He described Vessa's exposure, the council session, the exile to the eastern borderlands. He watched Soren process the fact that justice for Leora had arrived through someone else's carelessness rather than through anything Darius had built or forced. He did not try to reframe this. So she was cleared, Soren said, and still gone. Yes, and you've been searching since before that. Yes. Soren was quiet for a moment. His eyes were steady on Darius's face. Not hostile, not warm, simply present and reading, with a thoroughness that had nowhere to hide from. Do you understand what she gave up? He asked. Not in general, specifically. Darius held the question. I know parts of it, he said. She told me some of it yesterday. I think there are parts I won't fully understand because I wasn't there, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Something shifted slightly in Soren's expression. Not approval, exactly. Something more careful than that. The adjustment of an assessment in progress. He was quiet for a long moment. The camp sounds moved around them. Whined in the pines, a horse shifting its weight somewhere behind the tree line, the distant low exchange of voices from Darius's men. Then Soren said, She still loves you. Darius went very still. That makes it worse, not better. Soren's voice was even. Factual. The way he delivered the things that mattered most. You should know that. It would be easier for her if she didn't. She'd have been able to stop a long time ago. He stood, brushing frost from his coat with the calm practicality of someone concluding a necessary errand. I thought you should have accurate information. Darius looked at his son. This 7-year-old, who spoke like someone who had been quietly watching the world since before he had language for what he saw. I do, he said quietly, I know. Soren nodded once. Then he walked back toward the settlement, unhurried, leaving Darius alone with the thing he'd said, which was not a comfort, and was not meant to be, and was perhaps the most honest gift anyone had given him in 7 years. Chapter 8. He asked her on the 4th morning, not at the rock shelf, not anywhere that carried the weight of their previous conversation. He asked her in the ordinary space between the settlement's eastern boundary and the tree line, where the ground was flat and the frost had softened slightly in the mid-morning light. They were walking. Not together, exactly, but in the same direction, which had happened without either of them arranging it. He stopped. She stopped a half-step after. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know before I ask it that no is a complete answer. I won't ask again after this." Leora looked at him. "Come back to Valdrek." The words landed in the cold air between them and stayed there, neither of them moving, to fill the silence around them. A bird called somewhere in the upper canopy. Snow shifted off a branch somewhere to the left and fell without sound into the frost below. "Not immediately," he said. "Not as a condition of anything. As a choice made by you, with full knowledge of what it means and what it doesn't mean." He held her gaze steadily. "What it means. The boys are formally recognized as royal heirs, before the full council, on record. What was done to you is addressed publicly, not managed, not framed in political language, addressed. The people who were in that hall when you were exiled will hear the truth stated plainly by the person who should have stated it 7 years ago." He paused. "What it doesn't mean, you owe me anything for it. You don't return as a debt. You don't return because I found you. You return because it is what you want, if it is what you want. And if it isn't, if you tell me you have built something here that you are not willing to leave, I will ensure the boys' recognition happens regardless, and I will leave this settlement and not come back." Leora said nothing. "There are political arrangements at Valdrek that should have been dissolved a long time ago," he continued. "I am telling you they will be dissolved. Not as a promise designed to move you. As information you deserve to have. A beat. I am not offering you love as a transaction. I am showing you what I am prepared to destroy and rebuild, so that you have accurate information when you make your decision." He stopped there. He had clearly decided that was the full extent of what he was going to say, and he held to it. Leora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll think about it." And she walked back toward the settlement. She gave herself 3 days. This was not indecision. It was the deliberate, methodical approach she brought to every significant choice. The same approach that had kept her and her sons alive, in circumstances that rewarded carefulness. She needed to think, without the pressure of his presence, without the pull of his expression, without the complicated interference of everything she still felt, and had spent 7 years attempting to correctly categorize. Darius remained in the borderlands. He did not send messages. He did not position himself where she would encounter him. He had said he wouldn't pressure her, and he didn't. Which was, she noted with an irritating precision she couldn't turn off. Itself a kind of information. What she didn't expect was the settlement. Marit came to her on the 2nd evening. She sat across the fire the way she always did, taking up space without apology, completely uninterested in softening what she had to say, and told Leora that the large man and his company had been around for 4 days now, and the settlement had formed opinions. He fixed the Caro roof, she said, the section above the storage room that's been leaking since last winter. Wren mentioned it in passing, wasn't asking for help. And the next morning, that man was up there with 2 of his people working the problem. She paused. Didn't mention it after, didn't seem to think it required mentioning. Leora stirred the fire, said nothing. He sat with Elder Voss for nearly an hour 2 days ago, Marit continued. Asked him questions about the settlement's trade patterns. Listened to the answers. Actually listened, not the kind of listening that's just waiting to speak. She looked at Leora directly. I've met men of rank before. Men of rank listen to border settlement elders the way they listen to weather, politely and without retention. He wasn't always like this, Leora said, and then regretted saying it. Marit absorbed this without reaction. There's one more thing. She set down her cup. The Hess girl, youngest one, maybe 4 years old, fell near the well yesterday morning, cut her knee on the stone. Your man was the first one to her. Before her own mother got across the yard. The fire moved between them. I'm not telling you what to do, Marit said, standing with the efficiency of a woman who had delivered what she came to deliver and considered her role complete. I'm telling you what I saw. You're the one who knows what it means. Leora spent the third morning alone on the rock shelf. She sat with her back against the cold stone and looked out at the foothills, and did the honest accounting she owed herself, not the accounting of feeling. She had learned to distrust feeling as a primary instrument, because feeling was responsive, and she needed to be deliberate. The accounting of evidence. What did she know? She knew she had built a life here, a real one, built from nothing, with her hands and her knowledge, and the absolute refusal to be destroyed by something that had tried very hard to destroy her. That life was hers. It did not disappear because Darius had arrived in it. She knew her sons deserved to know who they were. Fully, formally, in the world that was theirs by blood, she had given them everything she could. This was the one thing she couldn't give them alone. She knew what the small things meant. She had learned to judge by small things, because small things were what remained when a person stopped performing. A repaired roof, an hour given genuinely to an elder who had nothing to offer in return, a 4-year-old girl, lifted from cold stone before her mother could cross a yard. She knew that she was tired. Not the exhaustion of a single hard season, but the deep tiredness of a woman who had been surviving for 7 years, and was ready, if the conditions allowed it, to do something other than survive. And she knew, with the quiet, devastating precision that Soren had apparently inherited from her, that she was done building her life around the shape of the wound Darius had made, done organizing her choices in relation to his failure. That was not strength. That was just a different kind of being controlled by someone who wasn't in the room. She was done with it. She found him at the edge of the lower camp as the afternoon light was failing. He saw her coming and stood and did not speak and waited. "I'll come to Valdrek," she said. Something moved across his face. She held up one hand before it could settle into anything she'd have to respond to. "Not for you," she said. "Not yet. For the boys. And for myself. Because I am finished building a life around what you didn't do." She held his gaze steadily. "That's what this is. You should know that clearly before we go any further." "I know it," he said. "Good." She turned back toward the settlement to begin the work of dismantling, carefully and without grief, the life she had made, and building, with the same deliberate hands, the beginning of whatever came next. Chapter 9. Valdrek received them without ceremony. This had been Darius's instruction, and it had not been popular with his inner circle. Aldrich had made his position clear in the measured, persistent way he made all his positions clear. That an arrival without formal reception created its own kind of statement. That the absence of ceremony could be read as ambivalence. That the council would interpret the lack of structure as an invitation to impose their own. Darius had listened to all of it and said, "No banners, no gate assembly, no processional." Leora had said nothing when he told her, but something in her shoulders had released slightly, and he had noted it, and said nothing either. So they came through the northern gate in the grey of early morning, 6 riders and a small cart, and the stronghold received them the way old stone received everything. Without expression, without welcome, with the massive indifference of a structure that had seen too much to be moved by arrival or departure. Leora looked at the walls as they passed beneath the gate arch. She had not looked away from them. Orin, riding beside her, was watching the stronghold with the open assessment of someone cataloguing everything at once. The height of the walls, the position of the sentinels, the worn paths between the outer buildings. Soren was looking at his mother. She felt his eyes and didn't turn. She was doing something private with the walls, settling something between herself and the stone that required no witnesses. Whatever Valdrek had meant to her when she left it, bleeding and alone, and carrying 2 lives she didn't yet know how to name, she was deciding now what it would mean going forward. She rode through without flinching. That was enough. The council assembled by mid-morning. The hall was old, older than the current stronghold in some structural sense, as though the hall had existed first, and the rest had been built in deference to it. The ceiling was high and dark with age. The walls hung with territorial markers rather than decoration. The long council table scarred from generations of use. Pack leaders occupied the seats along the left, territory chiefs along the right. The Wolf Elders, 3 of them, the oldest institutional authority in the Valdrek system, their role closer to witness than governance, sat at the far end in seats that had held their predecessors for 2 centuries. Leora stood near the entrance with the twins. She had dressed carefully, not richly. She had nothing rich, but with the precise dignity of a woman who understood that appearance in a room like this was its own form of language. Clean lines, good posture, the particular stillness of someone who had decided not to be diminished by a room that had once tried to erase her. Orin stood at her left, Soren at her right. Darius stood at the head of the table. He did not call the session to order with the usual formal language. He did not gesture for the clerk to read the agenda or invoke the traditional opening of a council proceeding. He simply began speaking, in the plain voice he used when he had decided that plainness was the most precise instrument available. He told the truth. Not a curated version of it. Not the truth as it could be framed to distribute responsibility across systemic failures and political pressures and the complexity of institutional decision-making. He told the room what had actually happened, that Leora had been falsely accused by a woman motivated by personal ambition, that the evidence against her had been fabricated, that he had known the accusation felt wrong and had chosen political management over immediate action, and that by the time he had fully understood his mistake, she was gone. He said, "My hesitation cost her 7 years. It cost my sons their birthright. The responsibility for that belongs to me. I am not distributing it." The hall was very quiet. Several council members had the particular stillness of people working to keep their expressions neutral and not fully succeeding. One territory chief, a broad man from the western passes named Gorvan, old family, old habits, shifted in his seat with the energy of someone preparing to reframe what he had just heard into something more manageable. He began to speak. Orin turned and looked at him. It was not a threatening look. It was not performed. It was simply the look of a 7-year-old boy who had inherited, completely and without dilution, his father's capacity to occupy a room. The chin level, the eyes direct, the absolute absence of apology for taking up space. It was so purely Darius that the resemblance struck the room like a physical thing. Gorvan stopped speaking. The elder wolves at the far end of the table exchanged a glance that carried the weight of people who had seen enough history to recognize a significant moment when it arrived. Leora stepped forward when Darius finished. She had not planned what she would say. She had decided only that she would say something, because this room owed her a witness, and she was the only person qualified to provide it. She did not rage. She had not come here to perform grief for a council's benefit or demonstrate suffering in a way that made it easier for them to process. She spoke quietly and with the precision she had developed across 7 years of saying only what she meant. She told them what she had built, not to impress them, to make them understand what their system had discarded and what it had cost to rebuild it from nothing. She told them what it meant to raise 2 sons alone in hard country, to give them values and strength and a sense of their own worth entirely without the kingdom that was supposed to have been their inheritance. She told them what it meant for a civilization to exile its own people on evidence no one had properly examined, because it was politically convenient to believe the accusation. "You didn't lose me," she said. "You discarded me. There's a difference. One is something that happens to you. The other is a choice." The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water, not loud, but displacing everything around them. No one spoke. The formal acknowledgement came from the eldest of the Wolf Elders, a woman named Sarah, whose family had held that seat for 3 generations. She rose slowly and spoke the traditional language of recognition. But she directed it first at Leora, before she turned to the twins. Orin and Soren were named royal heirs of Valdrek before the full council, on record, witnessed by the territorial authorities of 6 Pack regions. And then Sera turned to Leora and spoke words that the council had not heard directed at an Omega in living memory. A formal recognition of standing, of restoration, of the return of everything that had been wrongfully taken. Leora received it standing straight. She did not cry. She had done her crying alone, in cold shelters, in the dark, when no one was watching. She had paid that cost already, in full, without an audience. What she felt now was different. It was the particular, quiet weight of a thing finally being set right. Not loudly, not dramatically, but actually and on record, in the old hall, before the people who had the authority to make it true. It was, she thought, enough. For now it was enough. Chapter 10. Forgiveness did not arrive like weather. It did not come in suddenly, the way storms came in the Veyrath foothills, announced by pressure shifts and the particular smell of the air changing before the first drop fell. It did not arrive at all, in the sense of arriving. It moved the way seasons moved. So incrementally that you could not locate the moment of change. Only look back from some later point and understand that the landscape had shifted without asking your permission. Leora understood this about forgiveness. She had watched herself extend it to others over the years. To the borderland strangers who had been unkind before they were kind. To herself for the mistakes of those first desperate months. She knew its texture. She knew it was not a decision made once, but a direction chosen repeatedly, in small increments, over time. She did not rush it. She did not perform it. She simply lived inside Valdrek, and let the days accumulate and paid attention to what changed. The first thing she noticed was the corridors. She had expected them to feel like the site of something, like places where the air still held the shape of what had happened there 8 years ago. She had prepared herself in the careful way she prepared for things, to walk through spaces that would require management. The corridor outside the old council antechamber, the Eastern Gate passage where the exile order had been read, the places that had been the geography of the worst days of her life. They were just corridors, stone and torchlight, and the smell of cold air and old wood, and the ordinary sounds of a functioning stronghold moving through its daily rhythms. She walked through them and felt nothing dramatic. The past was present, but it was past, the way a healed wound was present in the slight irregularity of the skin over it. Noticeable if you pressed, not debilitating. She understood, walking through the eastern passage on the 9th morning, that the place had not changed. She was the one who had changed. She had built herself into something that Valdrek's stone walls could not diminish. In the years it had taken her to come back. The humiliation that had happened here had happened to a woman who no longer existed in the same form. That woman had survived into someone else. This one could walk the corridors without flinching. Darius gave Orin a seat at the territory strategy sessions. Not a symbolic seat, a real one, with a real copy of the current borderland maps, and the expectation that he would engage with the material. This had been controversial with 2 of the senior advisors, who held the opinion that 7 years old was not an appropriate age for council-adjacent exposure. Darius had listened to their objections with the patience of a man who had already made his decision, and wanted the record to show he had heard the concerns. Orin engaged with the material the way he engaged with everything. Directly, physically, without hesitation. He also disagreed with Darius twice in the first week. The first time, Leora heard about it second-hand from Aldrich, who delivered the information with the expression of a man who was not certain whether to be alarmed or entertained. Orin had disputed a proposed response protocol for the northern border settlements, on the grounds that it prioritized speed over community trust building and would therefore fail within 2 seasons. He had been specific. He had drawn on things he had observed in the foothills settlements for 7 years that the Valdrek Council, operating from a distance, had not seen. Darius had listened, had asked 2 questions, had amended the protocol. The second disagreement, Leora witnessed herself. Passing the open door of the strategy room, she stopped without meaning to. Orin was standing at the map table with the posture of someone who had stopped worrying about the size of the room, making his case with the flat directness she had raised him with. Darius was listening, not tolerating, not managing, actually listening, with the full attention she had seen him give to things that mattered. When Orin finished, Darius said, "You're right about the Eastern approach. We'll revise it." Orin nodded, satisfied in the uncomplicated way of a person who had expected to be taken seriously and had been. Leora moved on down the corridor. Something in her chest had shifted, quietly, without announcement. Soren found the library on the 3rd day and was not seen at meals for the better part of a week. He surfaced periodically. For food, for sleep, once to ask Leora a question about a historical territorial dispute that she couldn't answer, which had never happened before, and which she found, privately, extraordinary. He was reading the kingdom's history from the inside, building an architecture of understanding that she knew. Watching him disappear back into the library would eventually become something significant. She let him go. It was the best thing she had ever given him. Not the library, but the world that contained a library worth disappearing into. He had outgrown the battered histories she'd traded remedies for. He needed this, and it needed him, and watching him inhabit it was its own quiet form of healing. She found Darius in the courtyard on an evening 3 weeks after their arrival. Not performing anything, not positioned for observation, or managing the impression he made on the space around him. He was sitting with his back against the old courtyard wall, the worn section near the northern corner where the stone was darkest from weather, with a report across his knee and the expression of a man reading something he found genuinely absorbing, alone in the way that powerful men rarely allowed themselves to be seen, completely without armor. She sat beside him, not close, a foot of cold stone between them, the evening settling over the courtyard in layers of grey and blue, the torches along the inner wall not yet lit, the stronghold shifting into its quieter register. He didn't speak. She didn't speak. The report stayed on his knee. She didn't know what her hands were doing, resting, eventually, in her lap, still in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. The kind of stillness that wasn't braced for anything. They sat like that for a long time, long enough for the first torch to be lit along the wall, long enough for the courtyard sounds to settle into the particular quiet of a stronghold after the day's work was finished, long enough that the silence between them had changed from the silence of 2 people, deciding what to say, into the silence of 2 people who didn't currently need to say anything. Then Leora said, "I don't forgive you for what you didn't do." He went still. "I forgive you for who you became after." She said it the way she said the things she had thought about carefully, without excess, without performance, with the clean precision of someone who had located exactly the right words and trusted them to carry the weight without assistance. Darius didn't respond immediately. She had expected that. She had learned that his silences were not absence, but the opposite. The presence of someone giving a thing the space it deserved before responding to it. When he spoke, his voice was low, and without the careful management she had heard in it during the council session, during the formal moments, during the conversations that had required him to hold himself together in front of witnesses. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." Nothing else, she thought, exactly the right amount to say. The boys were arguing in the antechamber when she came back inside. She could hear them from the corridor. Orin's voice carrying the energy of someone who had a position and was committed to it. Soren's voice carrying the particular patience of someone who had a better position and was waiting for the right moment to deploy it. The subject, she gathered as she drew closer, was borderland trade equity, and whether Valdrek's current structure adequately served the smaller foothills, settlements, or whether systemic revision was necessary. They were 7 years old. She stood in the doorway and watched them. Orin with his hands on the map table, emphatic, specific, drawing on everything he had absorbed and observed and filed away in 7 years of growing up in hard country. Soren with his backs straight and his book closed, making his counter-argument in the even, layered way of someone who had read the historical precedents and intended to use them. Neither of them noticed her. She didn't announce herself. She stood in the doorway of the old stronghold that had exiled her, in the kingdom that had tried to erase her, and she watched her sons argue about how to make it better. These 2 boys she had raised alone in the mountains, who had become, without her fully tracking the moment it happened, people who would change this place. For the first time in 7 years, the feeling in her chest was not the careful, managed equilibrium of survival. It was something quieter than joy and more durable than relief. It was the feeling of a woman who had stopped arriving somewhere and started simply being there. She was home, not because the stone walls had changed, because she had, and she had brought her sons with her, and the rest of it, the healing, the rebuilding, the slow and honest work of a family finding its shape, was already, imperfectly and irrevocably, underway. This story was never really about a king finding his sons. It was about what a woman builds when everything is taken from her, and whether the thing she built is strong enough to survive the moment the world comes back, asking for forgiveness. Leora did not survive 7 years in the mountains because she was waiting to be rescued. She survived because she decided, in the coldest winter of her life, that her sons would not grow up defined by someone else's cruelty. That became her kingdom, long before Valdrek ever acknowledged her name. The most powerful moment in this story is not the reunion. It is Soren, 7 years old, looking at his father and saying, "She still loves you." That makes it worse, not better, because that is what betrayal by someone you love actually feels like. Not hatred, not indifference, the terrible weight of love that refused to leave, even when it had every reason to. Forgiveness, in the end, was not Leora's gift to Darius. It was her gift to herself. If this story moved you, if you felt every moment of Leora's strength, every ounce of Darius's regret, and every quiet beat of those 2 boys finding out who they are, then you are exactly who this channel was built for. Subscribe so you never miss a story. Hit the notification bell, because the next one is already coming. And it may be even harder to put down than this one. The pack grows stronger together. We'll see you in the next story.